In 1933, a mother in rural Ohio could stretch 15 cents into dinner for 6 people, and nobody at that table ever felt cheated. Think about that for a second. No refrigeration to rely on, no extra trip to the store, sometimes no icebox at all, just flour, a little fat, whatever the garden gave up, and a kind of resourcefulness we've mostly lost the muscle for. This isn't just a list of old recipes. It's a window into how ordinary families turned almost nothing into something that tasted like love. There are 3 things every one of these dishes shares. They stretched $1 until it nearly snapped. They used every last scrap of food in the house, and they were cooked by people who refused to let their kids go to bed hungry. Keep that in mind as we count down from 25, because by the end you'll understand why so many grandparents still crave these meals, even decades after they could afford anything else. We start with number 25, Hoover stew. Named half-mockingly after the president, many blamed for the Depression. This was macaroni, canned tomatoes, corn, and whatever hot dog or scrap of meat happened to be in the icebox, all simmered together in one pot. It fed a crowd off almost nothing and stretched across 2 dinners if you were careful. Families in shantytowns, literally called Hoovervilles, leaned on this dish because it needed no oven, no icebox space, and no butcher's bill. It tasted like survival, and it filled bellies when jobs had vanished overnight. That brings us to number 24, water pie. No apples, no cream, sometimes not even sugar to spare, just water, a bit of flour, butter if you had it, and a crust rolled thin to hide the truth. Bakers swore a splash of vanilla and a hot oven could trick a starch and water filling into tasting like custard. It was a dessert built entirely on faith and technique rather than ingredients, and mothers served it with pride, because putting any pie at all on the table during hard times was its own small victory worth celebrating. At number 23, dandelion greens with bacon grease. Every yard held a free vegetable patch if you knew where to look. Dandelion greens, bitter and wild, were boiled down and dressed with saved bacon grease and a splash of vinegar to cut the sharpness. Foraging wasn't a hobby then, it was strategy. Children were sent out with baskets before school, and mothers turned weeds most people ignored into a hot, iron-rich side dish. It tasted like the earth and like ingenuity, proof that hunger sharpens the eye for what's actually edible. At number 22, milk toast. When money and appetite both ran thin, milk toast was the answer. Stale bread, warmed milk, a little butter and sugar if it could be spared. It was gentle enough for sick children and cheap enough for anyone. Grandmothers speak of it now with a strange tenderness, remembering how a simple bowl of soaked bread felt like being cared for. There was no protein, barely any nutrition to speak of, but it was warm, it was filling for an hour, and it asked nothing of an empty pantry. At number 21, government cheese casserole. Later in the decade, relief programs distributed blocks of surplus cheese, and resourceful cooks melted it over noodles or rice with a splash of milk to stretch it further. The commodity cheese was salty, dense, almost rubbery, but it turned a nearly bare pantry into a hot dinner. Families who received relief rations felt the sting of charity, yet also relief itself, because a government cheese casserole meant nobody went to bed with an empty stomach that particular week, and that mattered more than pride. That brings us to number 20. Poor man's meatloaf with oats. Ground beef was a luxury, so cooks cut it with rolled oats, breadcrumbs, or crushed crackers until a half-pound stretched to feed 8. A little ketchup or tomato sauce on top disguised how little meat was actually inside. The trick was seasoning it heavily with onion and pepper, so nobody noticed the substitution. Families remember this dish fondly not because it was rich, but because it proved a working mother could take a scrap of meat and make it feel like a real Sunday dinner. At number 19, creamed chipped beef on toast. Soldiers and civilians alike knew this one, sometimes by a cruder nickname. Dried salted beef was reconstituted in a simple white sauce made from flour, milk, and butter, then poured over toast. It used dense, shelf-stable meat that lasted months without refrigeration, which made it a Depression staple long before it became a military ration. The salty richness of the sauce made a small amount of meat taste like plenty, and the toast underneath soaked up every last drop so nothing went to waste. At number 18, potato soup. Potatoes were the backbone of Depression cooking because they were cheap, filling, and stored for months in a root cellar. A simple soup of potatoes, onion, and milk thickened with a little flour could feed a family for 2 dinners running. Some households added a single strip of bacon just for flavor, nothing more. It sounds plain today, but in 1932, a hot bowl of potato soup on a cold night was the difference between a family that felt cared for and one that simply felt cold. At number 17, poor man's pudding. Rice, milk, sugar, and a little cinnamon simmered slowly until it thickened into something close to a custard. No eggs were needed, which made it accessible even when the henhouse wasn't laying. Cooks would let it cook low on the stove for over an hour, stirring constantly, turning cheap pantry staples into a dessert that felt indulgent. Children remember the smell of cinnamon simmering in milk as one of the few genuinely sweet, comforting memories from otherwise lean and difficult years. That brings us to number 16, mock apple pie. When apples were out of season or simply unaffordable, bakers reached for Ritz-style crackers, sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice to fake the filling entirely. The crackers softened in the syrup and took on a texture eerily close to stewed apple. This recipe actually appeared printed on cracker boxes during the era, a manufacturer's clever solution to a real shortage. Guests were reportedly fooled at church potlucks. It's a perfect symbol of the decade. Total scarcity met with total, cheerful, unashamed culinary invention. At number 15, bread pudding. Stale bread was never thrown away in a Depression kitchen. It was soaked in milk and egg, sweetened with whatever sugar or molasses was on hand, and baked until custardy. Raisins, if available, were a luxury addition. This dish turned yesterday's leftovers into tomorrow's dessert, embodying the era's core rule: nothing gets wasted, ever. Families still make bread pudding today, often without realizing its Depression roots, carrying forward a habit of thrift that started because throwing away food back then was simply unthinkable. At number 14, vinegar pie. Without lemons on hand, cooks reached for a splash of vinegar to fake a tart, citrusy custard filling. Combined with sugar, butter, and eggs, it baked into something surprisingly close to a chess pie. It's one of the strangest sounding dishes on this list, and also one of the most beloved by people who grew up on it. Proof that a resourceful cook could take the one sour ingredient sitting in the pantry and turn it into a genuinely craveable Sunday dessert. At number 13, cornmeal mush. Cornmeal boiled in water or milk until thick, then eaten hot with a little molasses, or fried the next morning in bacon grease until crisp outside and soft within. It cost pennies a pound and filled a family up fast. Southern and rural households leaned on it especially hard, since corn was often grown at home. That double life, soft supper tonight, crispy breakfast tomorrow, meant a single cheap batch of mush could quietly stretch its welcome across 2 entirely different meals. That brings us to number 12, beans and salt pork. Dried beans, a chunk of fatty salt pork, an onion, and hours of slow simmering on the back of the stove turned into a rich, protein-heavy pot that could feed a family for days. Beans were dirt cheap, stored indefinitely and multiplied in volume as they cooked. The salt pork, even just a small piece, seasoned the entire pot with smoky richness. This dish traveled from farmhouses to city tenements alike, uniting nearly every region of Depression-era America around the same humble pot. At number 11, fried bologna sandwiches. Bologna was one of the cheapest meats available, and frying a slice until its edges curled and crisped gave it a smoky, almost bacon-like flavor far beyond its price. Slapped between 2 slices of bread with a smear of mustard, it became a filling, satisfying lunch for factory workers and school children alike. It wasn't elegant, but it was hot, it was fast, and it turned a nickel's worth of lunch meat into something that actually tasted like somebody had cooked for you. At number 10, Johnny cakes. Cornmeal, water, or buttermilk, and a pinch of salt fried on a griddle until golden. No eggs, no leavening required. This simple flatbread traced back generations before the Depression, but became a daily staple when flour ran short and store-bought bread felt like an unaffordable extravagance. Served with molasses or a scrape of butter, Johnny Cakes proved that a family didn't need a fully stocked pantry to eat well. They just needed cornmeal, a hot skillet, and someone willing to stand over it. At number 9, egg foo young, Depression style. Home cooks stretched a couple of eggs with shredded cabbage, onion, and a bit of flour, frying the mixture into patties and topping them with a simple soy-flavored gravy. It was an American reinterpretation born from cheap vegetables and the desperate need to make scarce eggs go further. 2 eggs that might have made 1 small omelet instead became 4 or 5 hearty patties. It's a striking example of how thrifty households adapted and stretched even far-flung culinary ideas to survive. That brings us to number 8, butter and sugar sandwiches. When there was truly nothing else, bread spread with a thin layer of butter and a sprinkle of sugar became dinner, or more often a child's treat between chores. It sounds bare bones today, but for kids raised in it, this sandwich still triggers a rush of nostalgia. It represents something important. Even in the leanest years, mothers found a way to offer their children a small, sweet comfort, proof that tenderness could survive even when the pantry nearly couldn't. At number 7, creamed peas on toast. Canned or garden peas simmered into a simple white sauce and ladled over toast turned an inexpensive vegetable into a warm, filling meal that felt like more than the sum of its parts. It was often served on Fridays or meatless days, stretching a family's grocery budget across the whole week. The starchy toast underneath caught every drop of sauce, so nothing pooled and wasted on the plate. A small, quiet lesson in efficiency baked into an ordinary weeknight supper. At number 6, poor man's soup. A rotating cast of whatever vegetables were left in the bin, potato ends, onion skins peeled back to usable flesh, cabbage cores, simmered in water with a bouillon cube or a bone saved from a previous meal. No single recipe defined it, because every household's version depended entirely on what scraps remained that week. It taught an entire generation that soup wasn't a dish you planned, it was a dish you rescued from whatever was about to go bad. At number 5, Spam and rice. Spam arrived in 1937, and its shelf-stable pre-cooked meat became an instant depression favorite because it needed no icebox and no butcher. Sliced and fried until the edges browned and crisped, then served over a bed of plain white rice, it delivered protein and salt in a single affordable can. Families who couldn't reliably buy fresh meat suddenly had a pantry staple that lasted for months. It's still a comfort food in many households today, a direct, unbroken thread back to Depression-era ingenuity. That brings us to number 4, chicken feet soup. Nothing on the chicken went to waste, including the feet, which butchers often sold for pennies or gave away outright. Simmered for hours with onion, carrot, and whatever herbs were on hand, the feet released a deep, gelatin-rich broth that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. This soup reflected the era's deepest value, total, uncompromising use of the whole animal, because throwing away any part of a chicken when a family was hungry would have felt almost like a moral failure. At number 3, poor man's casserole. Layered noodles, canned tomatoes, and a thin scattering of whatever ground meat was affordable that week, baked together until bubbling and browned on top. It was the ultimate use-it-up dish, built entirely around clearing out the pantry before payday rather than following any fixed recipe. Every family had their own version shaped by whatever sat in their cupboard on a Tuesday night. That flexibility is exactly why it survived. It wasn't a recipe, it was a philosophy of never wasting what you had. At number 2, depression cake, also called wacky cake or crazy cake. This dessert needed no eggs, no milk, and no butter, ingredients that were often simply unavailable. Vinegar reacted with baking soda to provide the lift. Oil replaced butter, and cocoa powder made it taste rich despite costing almost nothing. It became a symbol of resilience baked directly into a recipe card, proof that even birthdays and small celebrations could still happen, dessert and all, no matter how empty the pantry looked that particular week. And finally, at number 1, Sunday pot roast, stretched. When a family could finally afford a small, tough cut of beef, it was braised for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until it fell apart. And then stretched across 2 or 3 meals, the leftover broth reused for soup later in the week. This was the meal families saved for, planned around, and remembered for decades afterward, because it represented something beyond food itself, the rare, hard-won feeling of abundance in a decade that offered so little of it to anyone. These 25 dishes weren't just recipes scribbled on index cards, they were survival strategies passed from mother to daughter, proof that love and resourcefulness can make a feast out of almost nothing. The families who lived through the Depression carried these flavors for the rest of their lives, cooking them long after hard times had passed, not out of necessity anymore, but out of memory. That's the real recipe hidden inside every one of these dishes. Gratitude, stretched as far as it could possibly go. If any of these meals remind you of your own grandmother's kitchen, hit like and subscribe for more forgotten stories from America's past.